The morning mist clung to the scarred landscape like a shroud, but beneath its ethereal veil lay the most formidable fortress on the Western Front, Vimy. Ridge stretched across the Artois countryside like a sleeping giant, its chalk cliffs and underground tunnels having swallowed the dreams of French and British armies for over 2 years. Now, in the spring of 1917, it would face a new challenger, one that would emerge from the crucible of this battle as a nation reborn. Major General Arthur Currie stood at his command post, studying the intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of German defenses. The ridge rose 145 meters above the Douai plain, offering the enemy unobstructed views of Allied positions for miles. 3 defensive lines, each more deadly than the last, had been carved into the limestone. The Zuschenstellung, the intermediate line, bristled with machine gun nests and barbed wire entanglements that had claimed thousands of lives in previous assaults. Lieutenant Colonel Gar Adamson of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry had witnessed the futility of earlier attacks. The French 10th Army had thrown themselves against these slopes in May 1915, gaining nothing but casualty lists. The British had tried again in September 1915 during the Battle of Loos, only to be repulsed with horrific losses. The ridge had earned its reputation as an impregnable fortress, a place where empires sent their sons to die. The German 4th Army, under Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, had turned Vimy Ridge into a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Deep bunkers, some 30 feet underground, connected by a maze of tunnels that stretched for miles. The village of Vimy itself had been transformed into a fortress, its ruins hiding concrete strongpoints and artillery observation posts. General Friedrich von Lossberg, the architect of German defensive doctrine, had personally overseen the fortification of this position, as referenced in historical accounts from the Canadian War Museum archives. The German defenders possessed every advantage that military science could provide. Their artillery, positioned on the reverse slopes, could rain death upon any attacking force while remaining hidden from Allied observation. The chalky soil that made tunneling possible for the defenders also created a white dust that would betray any movement across no man's land during daylight hours but the Canadian Corps. Formed in September 1915 under the command of Lieutenant General Julian Byng, represented something new on the Western Front. These were not the weary veterans of the Somme or Passchendaele, ground down by years of futile attacks. The 4 Canadian divisions, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, had been training together, developing new tactics that would revolutionize infantry warfare. The men who would assault Vimy Ridge came from across the vast expanse of Canada. Prairie farmers from Saskatchewan stood alongside lumberjacks from British Columbia. Miners from Nova Scotia fought beside clerks from Ontario. They shared a common purpose that transcended regional loyalties. They were Canadians, and they would succeed where others had failed. The stage was set for a battle that would echo through history, not merely as another engagement in the Great War, but as the moment when 4 British colonies would fight together, as one nation, and emerge from the smoke and thunder as Canadians. The ridge that had devoured armies was about to face its greatest test. Lieutenant General Julian Byng walked through the communication trenches in the pre-dawn darkness of April 2nd, 1917, his boots squelching in the mud that had become as familiar as breathing. To every soldier on the Western Front, the British officer who commanded the Canadian Corps possessed a keen understanding of what separated victory from catastrophe in this war of attrition. Unlike his predecessors, Byng had learned the lessons written in blood across the battlefields of France and Belgium. The transformation of the Canadian Corps under Byng's leadership had been nothing short of revolutionary when he assumed command. In May 1916, he inherited 4 divisions that had fought bravely but independently. The 2nd Canadian Division had distinguished itself at Ypres, while the 1st had earned glory at Neuve-Chapelle. But glory meant nothing if it came at the cost of strategic failure. Byng was determined to forge these colonial units into a weapon that could crack the German defensive system. Major General Arthur Currie, commanding the 1st Canadian Division, had become Byng's most trusted subordinate. The former real estate developer from Victoria possessed an intuitive grasp of tactics that compensated for his lack of formal military education. Curry understood that the old methods, the massed infantry charges that had characterized the early years of the war, were not merely obsolete, but suicidal against modern defensive systems. The Canadian Corps had spent the winter of 1916 to 1917 in intensive training, developing what would become known as the Vimy glide. This new tactical approach emphasized coordination between infantry, artillery, and engineers on a scale never before attempted. Each platoon was trained to operate independently, every soldier understanding not just his own role, but the roles of his comrades. This departure from rigid military hierarchy represented a uniquely Canadian approach to warfare. Artillery preparation would be the key to success, but not the prolonged bombardments that had characterized previous offensives. These marathon barrages, lasting weeks, had only served to warn the enemy of impending attacks while churning the battlefield into impassable moonscapes. Instead, the Canadian Corps would rely on a precisely timed creeping barrage, a curtain of fire that would move forward at exactly 100 yards every 3 minutes, as documented in the official history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The planning for Vimy Ridge represented a departure from traditional military doctrine. Every soldier, from private to general, received detailed maps of the German positions. Scale models of the ridge were constructed behind the lines, allowing each unit to rehearse their specific objectives. This democratization of tactical knowledge was revolutionary in armies where information had traditionally been restricted to officers. The Royal Flying Corps, under the command of Major General Hugh Trenchard, had achieved air superiority over the ridge through relentless fighting during Bloody April. Canadian pilots like Billy Bishop and Raymond Collishaw had paid a terrible price for this advantage. But their sacrifice ensured that German observation balloons and reconnaissance aircraft could not interfere with the assault preparations. Underground, the war had taken on a different character entirely. Canadian miners and engineers had spent months driving tunnels beneath the German lines. A dangerous game of cat and mouse played out in the darkness below ground. The thunder of explosions echoed through the earth as German and Canadian tunnel systems intersected, leading to vicious underground battles fought with pistols and grenades in confined spaces where a man could barely stand upright. The date had been set, April 9th, 1917. As Easter Monday approached, 100,000 Canadian soldiers prepared to test themselves against the fortress that had defied the combined might of France and Britain. The ridge awaited, its German defenders confident in their impregnable positions, unaware that they faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. The final week before the assault transformed the Canadian sector into a symphony of controlled violence. Artillery pieces, more than 1,000 strong, had been positioned in carefully surveyed locations throughout the last days of March 1917. The guns ranged from the massive 15-inch howitzers that could hurl shells weighing nearly a ton to the quick-firing 18-pounders that would provide the backbone of the creeping barrage. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton of the Canadian Corps Heavy Artillery had revolutionized the science of gunnery through his innovations in sound ranging and flash spotting. His techniques developed during the winter months allowed Canadian gunners to locate German batteries with unprecedented precision. The traditional method of artillery duels, where opposing guns blazed away at each other for days, had been replaced by surgical strikes that eliminated enemy positions before they could respond. The German defenders, commanded by General Karl von Fassbender of the 6th Army, had grown accustomed to the rhythm of Allied bombardments. The preliminary shelling would begin weeks before an assault, gradually increasing in intensity until the infantry attack commenced. This predictable pattern had allowed German forces to withdraw their troops to deep shelters during bombardments, then emerge to man their positions when the barrage lifted. But the Canadian approach would be different. The bombardment began on March 20th, 1917, with a measured cadence that gave no indication of the storm to come. German soldiers in the frontline trenches reported the shelling as normal harassment, unaware that Canadian observers were methodically plotting the location of every machine gun nest every strong point, every piece of artillery that revealed itself by firing, counter-battery work became the specialty of the Canadian artillery. Using the new techniques pioneered by MacNaughton, Canadian gunners systematically destroyed German artillery positions in a campaign that lasted 3 weeks. The chalk dust that rose from the ridge with each explosion created a white cloud that could be seen from miles away, earning the bombardment the nickname the White Death among German defenders. Major General David Watson, commanding the 4th Canadian Division, had positioned his men in jumping-off trenches that had been dug closer to the German lines than any previous assault force had dared. The final 400 yards of no man's land had been crossed by tunnel systems that allowed Canadian soldiers to emerge within grenade range of enemy positions. This bold innovation reduced the distance that attacking infantry would have to cover under fire from nearly a mile to less than 200 yards in some sectors. As documented in the regimental history of the Royal Canadian Regiment, the psychological preparation of the troops was as important as the physical preparations. Canadian soldiers knew they were fighting for more than military objectives. They were fighting to prove that Canada could stand as an equal among the nations of the world. The Ridge had become a symbol of national aspiration, a test that would determine whether the Dominion of Canada would emerge from the war as a mature nation or remain a collection of British colonies. The final 24 hours before the assault saw a transformation in the bombardment that caught German defenders completely off guard. The methodical shelling of the previous weeks was replaced by a hurricane of fire that surpassed anything previously experienced on the Western Front. German soldiers huddled in their deep bunkers as the earth shook with the impact of 100,000 shells falling on their positions in a single day. Communication lines between German frontline positions and their headquarters were systematically severed by Canadian artillery. Telephone cables, buried deep underground, were cut by the massive explosions of heavy howitzers. Wireless stations were destroyed by precisely aimed shells that had been plotted during weeks of observation. By the evening of April 8, 1917, the German defenders of Vimy Ridge had been effectively isolated from their command structure. The stage was set for the greatest test in Canadian military history. As darkness fell on April 8th, 100,000 Canadian soldiers made their final preparations for battle, knowing that the dawn would bring either triumph or tragedy on an unprecedented scale. Easter Monday, April 9th, 1917, broke gray and cold across the Artois countryside. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the Canadian Corps unleashed a barrage that transformed the dawn into artificial daylight. The coordinated fire of 983 artillery pieces created a wall of explosions that marched across the German positions. At the precise speed of infantry advance, 100 yards every 3 minutes, Private Thomas Deinzen, of the 42nd Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force, crouched in the jumping-off trench as the earth trembled beneath his feet. The Danish-born soldier, who would later become the brother-in-law of author Karen Blixen, watched as the creeping barrage transformed the ridge into a landscape from hell. The technique that Canadian artillery had perfected allowed the infantry to follow within 50 yards of their own exploding shells, a deadly dance that required perfect timing and absolute trust in their gunners. The assault began with mathematical precision. The 1st Canadian Division, under Major General Arthur Currie, advanced against the northern section of the ridge. The 2nd Division, commanded by Major General Henry Burstall, targeted the center. The 3rd Division, led by Major General Louis Lipsett, aimed for the southern slopes. The 4th Division, under Major General David Watson, would face the strongest German positions around the village of Vimy itself. German machine gunners, emerging from their deep bunkers as the barrage passed over them, found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered. Canadian soldiers advanced in small groups, using tactics that emphasized flexibility and initiative rather than rigid adherence to orders. When one group was pinned down by enemy fire, others would maneuver around the flanks or call for artillery support with unprecedented speed and accuracy. The German 79th Reserve Infantry Division, commanded by General von Fassbender, had been confident in their defensive positions. The 3 lines of trenches, connected by communication tunnels and protected by belts of barbed wire, had proven impregnable to previous attacks. But the Canadian assault swept through the first line of German trenches within 30 minutes, capturing positions that had been considered invincible. As referenced in the official German Army history of the Great War, the speed of the Canadian advance caught defending forces completely off guard. The traditional defensive tactic of allowing attackers to advance into killing zones before opening fire proved useless against troops who moved with the protection of their own artillery. German strongpoints found themselves bypassed and surrounded. Before they could effectively engage the attacking infantry, the village of Thelis fell to the 2nd Canadian Division by 7 in the morning. The 3rd Division captured the Pimple, a heavily fortified position that dominated the southern approach to the ridge. The 4th Division, facing the most determined resistance, fought a savage battle for Hill 145, the highest point of the ridge. Canadian soldiers used tactics learned in the lumber camps and mining towns of their homeland, fighting from shell hole to shell hole with a tenacity that German defenders had never encountered. Lieutenant Colonel Ager Adamson of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry led his men through the wire entanglements that had been shattered by the preparatory bombardment. The veteran of the Boer War had seen many battles, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic destruction of German defensive positions by Canadian artillery. Machine gun nests that had dominated the battlefield for months were reduced to smoking craters. Within minutes of the assault beginning, the success of the first phase surprised even the most optimistic Canadian commanders. By 8 in the morning, the entire first line of German trenches was in Canadian hands. The second line, which had been expected to hold out for days, began to crumble as Canadian soldiers infiltrated through gaps in the defenses. The rigid German defensive system, designed to channel attackers into predetermined killing zones, proved unable to adapt to the fluid tactics employed by the Canadian corps. The battle for Vimy Ridge was far from over, but already it was clear that something extraordinary was happening on the Western Front. For the first time in the war, a major German defensive position was being systematically dismantled by an attacking force that had learned to fight as a cohesive unit rather than a collection of individual battalions. By midday on April 9th, 1917, the Canadian Corps had achieved what French and British forces had failed to accomplish in 2.5 years of bloody attacks. The first 2 lines of German trenches across the entire 4-mile front were in Canadian hands. But the most formidable challenges still lay ahead. The 3rd line of German defenses, anchored on the reverse slope of the ridge, contained the strongest positions and most determined defenders. The German 4th Army, under Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, had rushed reinforcements to the threatened sector. The 11th Bavarian Infantry Division, considered among the finest units in the German army, counterattacked with the fury of troops fighting for their homeland. The battle for the final German positions would test every lesson the Canadian Corps had learned about modern warfare. Major General Arthur Currie's 1st Canadian Division faced the most complex tactical challenge of the day. The German strong point known as the Pimple rose like a fortress from the northern end of the ridge, its concrete bunkers and interlocking fields of fire having resisted every previous assault. The position commanded the entire battlefield, and its capture was essential to securing the Canadian victory. The 10th Canadian Infantry Battalion, recruited from the ranches and farms of Alberta, approached the Pimple with the methodical precision that had characterized the entire assault. Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Bell Irving, a veteran of the Northwest Rebellion, led his men through a maze of shell holes and communication trenches, using the broken ground to mask their advance from German observers. The battle for individual German strongpoints became a series of small unit actions that showcased the tactical flexibility of Canadian soldiers. Sergeant Ellis Sifton of the 18th Battalion single-handedly captured a German machine gun position that had been holding up the advance of an entire company. His actions, typical of the initiative shown by Canadian soldiers throughout the battle, earned him the Victoria Cross posthumously when he was killed moments later by German counterfire. The German defenders fought with the desperation of men who understood that their defeat would have consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. The loss of Vimy Ridge would expose the entire German defensive system in northern France to Allied observation and artillery fire. General von Fassbender committed his last reserves to holding the third line of trenches, knowing that failure would precipitate a general German withdrawal from the salient Canadian engineers. Working under fire, began the process of consolidating the captured positions. The extensive tunnel systems that had given the Germans such a defensive advantage were now turned against them. Canadian soldiers used the underground network to move reinforcements and supplies forward while remaining protected from German artillery fire. The very engineering that had made the ridge impregnable now facilitated its occupation by Canadian forces, as documented in the War Diary of the Canadian Corps. The afternoon of April 9th saw the most intense fighting of the entire battle. German artillery, repositioned on the heights beyond the ridge, poured fire into the Canadian positions. The chalk dust that rose from each explosion created a white fog that limited visibility to a few yards. In this surreal landscape, Canadian and German soldiers fought hand-to-hand combat in shell holes and collapsed trenches. The 4th Canadian Division, under Major General David Watson, faced the final German stronghold at Hill 145. The position, known to German defenders as the Watchtower, had been carved from solid rock and reinforced with concrete and steel. Its capture would complete the Canadian victory. But the cost would be measured in the lives of men who had traveled 3,000 miles to die on a French hillside. Private John Pattison of the 50th Battalion, a veteran of the Klondike Gold Rush, led the final assault on the German position. The 42-year-old soldier from Ontario had enlisted despite his age, driven by a sense of duty that transcended personal safety. His lone charge against the German machine gun nest that dominated the summit of the ridge became legendary among Canadian soldiers. Pattison's Victoria Cross would be awarded posthumously, but his sacrifice secured the final objective of the battle. By 4 in the afternoon, the Canadian flag flew from the highest point of Vimy Ridge. The fortress that had defied the combined armies of France and Britain had fallen to Canadian soldiers in a single day. The cost had been significant, 3,598 Canadian casualties, but the victory was complete and decisive. The silence that descended upon Vimy Ridge in the early evening of April 9th, 1917, was unlike anything the Western Front had experienced in nearly 3 years of warfare. For the first time since the beginning of trench warfare, a major German defensive position had been completely overrun and secured by Allied forces. The Canadian Corps had accomplished in one day what had eluded French and British armies for over 2 years. Lieutenant General Julian Byng stood on the summit of Hill 145 as the sun set over the Douai Plain, now clearly visible from Canadian positions for the first time since the war began. The strategic value of the ridge became immediately apparent. German supply lines, reserve positions, and artillery emplacements that had been hidden behind the ridge now lay exposed to Allied observation and fire. The entire German defensive system in northern France would have to be reorganized. The prisoners taken during the battle provided intelligence that confirmed the magnitude of the Canadian achievement. The 4th German Army had considered Vimy Ridge to be impregnable, position that would anchor their defensive line for the remainder of the war. The loss of the ridge forced an immediate German withdrawal from the surrounding salient. Abandoning positions that had been held since 1914, Major General Arthur Currie, writing in his post-battle report, emphasized the revolutionary nature of the tactics employed by Canadian forces. The integration of infantry, artillery, engineers had created a combined arms approach that maximized the effectiveness of each component. The creeping barrage had evolved from a simple artillery technique into a sophisticated system that allowed infantry to advance under the protection of their own guns. The success at Vimy Ridge had profound implications for the development of modern military tactics. The German army, long considered the most professional in the world, began a comprehensive study of Canadian methods. The flexible small unit tactics that had proven so effective would be adopted by German stormtroopers in their own offensive operations later in the war. The capture of the ridge also had immediate strategic consequences for the Allied war effort. The high ground now in Canadian hands provided observation posts that could direct artillery fire against German positions dozens of miles away. The elaborate tunnel systems beneath the ridge were expanded and improved, creating an underground fortress that could shelter an entire division from enemy bombardment. As referenced in the memoirs of General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, the loss of Vimy Ridge represented a turning point in German defensive strategy. The policy of holding every yard of ground at all costs was abandoned in favor of a more flexible defense in depth. The ridge had proven that even the strongest positions could be overwhelmed by attackers who combined superior tactics with adequate preparation. The Canadian Corps was reorganized in the weeks following the battle, with Arthur Currie replacing Julian Byng as commander when the latter was promoted to command the 3rd British Army. This change marked the beginning of true Canadian independence. In military affairs, as the Dominion government insisted that Canadian forces be commanded by Canadian officers whenever possible, the victory at Vimy Ridge transformed the international perception of Canada from a British colony to a nation capable of independent military action. The 4 Canadian divisions had fought together for the first time as a unified corps, and their success demonstrated that colonial forces could match or exceed the performance of European armies. The ridge became a symbol of Canadian national identity, a place where the country had proven itself on the world stage. The tactical innovations developed for the Vimy assault would influence military doctrine for decades to come. The combination of detailed planning, flexible execution, and integrated combined arms would become the standard for successful offensive operations. The Canadian Corps had created a template for victory that would be studied and copied by armies around the world. The men who had fought at Vimy Ridge returned to their units with a new sense of pride and confidence. They had faced the strongest German defenses and emerged victorious through superior tactics and individual courage. The ridge had tested every aspect of their training and preparation, and they had not been found wanting. The spring of 1917 marked the beginning of a new chapter in Canadian military history, one written in the chalk dust and blood of Vimy Ridge. The tactical innovations pioneered by the Canadian Corps would be refined and expanded throughout the remaining months of the Great War, leading to a string of victories that would establish Canada as one of the most effective fighting forces on the Western Front. The success at Vimy Ridge provided the template for future Canadian operations. The Battle of Hill 70 in August 1917, the crossing of the Canal du Nord in September 1918, and the capture of Valenciennes in November 1918 all employed variations of the tactics first perfected on the slopes of Vimy. The Canadian Corps had learned to fight as a unified force, and their expertise would prove decisive in the final Allied offensive that ended the war. General Arthur Currie, now commanding the Canadian Corps, implemented a training program that spread the lessons of Vimy throughout the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Every battalion was required to study the battle in detail, understanding not just what had happened, but why it had succeeded where previous attacks had failed. The democratization of tactical knowledge that had characterized the expelled Vimy assault became a permanent feature of Canadian military doctrine. The international recognition of Canadian military prowess led to greater political autonomy for the Dominion. Prime Minister Robert Borden insisted that Canada sign the Treaty of Versailles as an independent nation rather than as part of the British Empire. The country that had entered the war as a colony would emerge as a founding member of the League of Nations. Its status, secured by the blood, spilled on European battlefields. The ridge itself became a place of pilgrimage for Canadians seeking to understand their national identity. The Canadian government purchased the battlefield in 1902, creating a memorial park that would preserve the trenches and shell holes where Canadian soldiers had fought and died. The Vimy Memorial, designed by Walter Allward and completed in 1936, stands as a testament to Canadian sacrifice and achievement. The names of the men who died at Vimy Ridge are carved into the memorial's stone walls, but their true monument is the nation they helped to create. The battle marked the moment when Canada ceased to be a collection of British colonies and became a unified country with its own distinct identity. The ridge had been their crucible, and they had emerged transformed, as documented in the official history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The victory at Vimy Ridge represented more than a tactical success. It was the birth of Canadian military. Tradition. The maple leaf badge worn by Canadian soldiers had been earned through combat against the best troops of the German army. The Ridge had proven that Canadian soldiers could fight as equals with any force in the world. The tactical innovations developed for the Vimy assault influenced military doctrine far beyond the Canadian corps. The British Army adopted many Canadian techniques, particularly the sophisticated use of artillery in support of infantry advances. The French Army, impressed by Canadian success, sent observers to study Canadian training methods. Even the German Army, in its post-war analysis of the battle, acknowledged the superiority of Canadian tactics. The veterans of Vimy Ridge returned to Canada with a new understanding of their country's place in the world. They had proven that Canada could stand among the nations of the earth as an equal, that colonial status was a choice rather than an inevitability. The Ridge had been their testing ground, and they had passed the test with honor. The battle for Vimy Ridge ended on April 9, 1917. But its legacy continues to shape Canadian identity more than a century later. The Ridge stands as a reminder that nations are not born from documents or declarations, but from the shared sacrifice of citizens who choose to fight for something greater than themselves. The men who climbed those chalk slopes on Easter Monday had carried more than rifles and grenades. They'd carried the hopes and dreams of a young nation seeking to prove itself worthy of independence. The victory at Vimy Ridge transformed Canada from a British dominion into a sovereign nation, earned through courage and sacrifice on the battlefields of France. The Ridge had been their mountain to climb, and they had reached the summit together as Canadians.